On a humid afternoon in August of 1981, Daniel Carr set his toolbox on the worn carpet of apartment 3B at the Riverside Gardens complex in Arlington, Virginia, believing he was there to fix a Zenith console radio that refused to hold a station. He expected to replace a few tubes, adjust the tuning mechanism, and collect his $25 service fee before moving on to his next call. The previous decade had taught him that most repair jobs were routine, that people's problems usually had simple solutions, and that the most exciting thing about his work was occasionally finding a dead mouse inside a television chassis. He had absolutely no reason to suspect that this particular radio, this unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, would expose him to a world of deception that operated invisibly beneath the surface of suburban American life, or that his technical expertise would accidentally unravel an intelligence operation that had remained undetected for nearly 4 years. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Daniel Carr was 39 years old that summer, a man whose premature gray hair and reading glasses made him look older, though his hands remained steady and his mind stayed sharp for the technical puzzles that filled his days. He had operated Carr Electronics Repair from a small storefront on Wilson Boulevard for 11 years, building a reputation for honesty and skill that attracted customers from across Arlington County. His shop occupied the ground floor of a 2-story brick building between a dry cleaner and a Vietnamese restaurant, its front window displaying a hand-painted sign that read, "Radios, televisions, and small appliances. No job too small." The sign had been painted by his wife, Linda, back in 1970 when they'd first opened, and though the paint had faded and chipped over the years, Daniel refused to replace it because it reminded him of simpler times before their daughter was born, before mortgage payments became a constant worry, before the recession had made people less willing to repair old electronics and more likely to simply buy replacements from the new discount stores spreading across the suburbs. Daniel had learned his trade in the Navy, where he'd spent 4 years as an electronics technician, maintaining radar and communication systems aboard destroyers in the Pacific. The service had taught him discipline and precision, but it had also taught him to recognize patterns, to understand that complex systems often failed because of simple causes, and that thoroughness mattered more than speed when diagnosing problems. After his discharge in 1970, he'd used his GI Bill benefits to attend a vocational program in television repair, then opened his shop with money borrowed from Linda's father and a determination to succeed through meticulous work rather than flashy advertising. The strategy had worked well enough to keep them afloat, though never quite well enough to eliminate the constant low-level anxiety about whether next month's revenue would cover expenses. The customer who had called that morning was a woman named Helena Novak, her voice carrying the faint trace of an Eastern European accent that Daniel couldn't quite place. She'd explained that her console radio had begun producing strange interference, that stations would fade in and out unpredictably, and that sometimes she heard what sounded like faint voices speaking in languages she didn't recognize bleeding through from frequencies that shouldn't have been accessible on a standard AM/FM receiver. Daniel had encountered similar problems before, usually caused by aging capacitors or drift in the tuning circuits, and he'd quoted her his standard house call rate of $25 plus parts. She'd agreed immediately, giving him an address in the Riverside Gardens apartment complex and requesting that he come in the afternoon when her husband would be at work and she could supervise the repair without distraction. The Riverside Gardens complex was typical of the low-rise apartment buildings that had proliferated across Arlington during the post-war housing boom. 3-story brick structures arranged around parking lots and minimal landscaping, home to young families, retirees, and the transient population of government workers who cycled through the Washington area on temporary assignments. Daniel had performed service calls there dozens of times over the years, fixing televisions for elderly widows and stereos for young couples who couldn't afford to replace broken equipment. The complex was unremarkable in every way, neither particularly well-maintained nor notably run down, simply existing as one more anonymous residential building in a suburb full of such buildings. Helena Novak answered the door on his first knock, a woman in her mid-40s with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and sharp blue eyes that studied him with an intensity that seemed excessive for someone simply hiring a repairman. She wore a simple house dress and no jewelry except for a plain gold wedding band, and her apartment, visible through the doorway, was furnished with the kind of modest furniture that suggested people who lived carefully within limited means. She invited him inside with a formal politeness that felt slightly foreign, not unfriendly, but lacking the casual warmth that most American housewives displayed when welcoming service workers into their homes. The radio sat against the far wall of the living room, a large Zenith console model from the early 1970s, housed in a walnut veneer cabinet that also contained a turntable. Daniel knelt beside it and asked Mrs. Novak to demonstrate the problem. She turned it on, and immediately Daniel heard what she'd described. The normal programming was there, but underneath it ran a layer of interference that pulsed and faded with a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate rather than random. As he fine-tuned the dial, he occasionally caught fragments of what might have been voices, though too distorted to make out words or even definitively identify as human speech. Mrs. Novak left him to work, retreating to the kitchen where he could hear her preparing coffee, and Daniel removed the back panel of the radio to begin his diagnosis. The interior was clean and well-maintained, with no obvious signs of damage or amateur repairs. He began his standard troubleshooting sequence, testing tubes with his portable tube tester, checking connections, measuring voltages. Everything appeared normal, yet the interference persisted, and more puzzlingly, it seemed to vary in intensity based on the radio's physical orientation rather than which station he tuned to, as if the interference was coming from an external source rather than from within the radio itself. Daniel had encountered external interference before, usually from nearby electrical equipment or occasionally from ham radio operators whose signals bled through when they violated FCC power regulations. But this was different. The interference had a structured quality, brief bursts of signal that lasted perhaps 2 or 3 seconds, followed by silence, then another burst. It reminded him of the telemetry transmissions he'd monitored in the Navy, the compressed data packets that military systems used to send information efficiently. He pulled the chassis further out of the cabinet to access the components more easily, and that's when he saw it. Attached to the underside of the wooden cabinet, hidden from view unless someone specifically removed the radio chassis and looked upward into the empty space, was a small metal device about the size of a cigarette pack. It was connected by thin wires to the radio's antenna terminal, using the radio's own antenna as part of its transmission system. The device was professionally manufactured, with clean solder joints and military-grade components, definitely not something that had any legitimate purpose in a civilian radio. Daniel's first thought was that this might be some kind of illegal radio modification, perhaps equipment for pirate broadcasting or unauthorized ham radio operation. But as he examined it more closely, his Navy training kicked in, and he recognized certain design elements, the type of crystal oscillator used, the configuration of the transmission circuit, the shielding around sensitive components. This was a burst transmitter designed to send short, high-speed transmissions that would be difficult to detect or intercept. He'd seen similar devices in classified briefings during his Navy service, though the examples shown then had been much larger and less sophisticated than this miniaturized version. Daniel's hands began to shake slightly as the implications crystallized. Someone had deliberately installed espionage equipment inside Mrs. Novak's radio, equipment designed to transmit information to a remote receiver. The device was professionally made, far beyond the capability of amateur electronics enthusiasts. This was intelligence work, the kind of technology that only government agencies possessed. And given Mrs. Novak's Eastern European accent, given that this was 1981 in Arlington, Virginia, just across the river from Washington and all its government agencies and military installations, the most likely explanation was that this apartment was connected to Soviet intelligence operations. Daniel forced himself to remain calm, to think through his options. He was kneeling on the floor of what might be a KGB safe house, having just discovered evidence of espionage. Mrs. Novak was in the kitchen, unaware that he'd found anything unusual. She would return shortly, expecting him to explain what was wrong with her radio. If she realized he'd discovered the transmitter, if she suspected he understood what it was, he might be in serious danger. Soviet intelligence services didn't leave loose ends, and an American repairman who stumbled onto their operations certainly qualified as a loose end. His military training provided a framework for handling the fear now flooding through his system. First, maintain cover. Behave normally. Show no indication that anything unusual had been discovered. Second, extract yourself from the situation safely. Third, report to proper authorities. Daniel carefully photographed the device using the small camera he always carried for documenting complex repairs, taking 3 quick shots that captured the device from different angles and showed its connection to the radio's antenna system. He then carefully reconnected everything exactly as he'd found it, replaced the chassis in the cabinet, and reattached the back panel. Mrs. Novak returned with coffee just as he was finishing. "Well?" she asked, her accent slightly thicker than it had been earlier, or perhaps Daniel was simply more attuned to it now. "Did you find the problem?" Daniel forced himself to speak calmly, keeping his voice professional. "Yes, ma'am. You've got a failing capacitor in the IF stage. It's causing the tuning circuit to drift, which is why you're picking up interference from adjacent frequencies. The voices you're hearing are probably just crosstalk from other stations. It's a common problem in radios this age." It was a plausible lie, technical enough to sound convincing, vague enough to be difficult to verify. Mrs. Novak frowned. "Can you fix it?" "I'll need to order the part," Daniel said, gathering his tools. "It should arrive in about a week. I'll call you when it comes in, and we can schedule another appointment." Mrs. Novak seemed dissatisfied, but accepted this explanation. She paid him the $25 house call fee in cash, counted out from a leather wallet that contained far more money than most housewives, carried for daily expenses. Daniel took the bills with hands he kept deliberately steady, thanked her politely, and left the apartment at a measured pace that he hoped suggested routine professionalism rather than barely controlled panic. He walked to his service van, parked 3 spaces away, fighting the urge to run. He placed his toolbox in the back, climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove out of the Riverside Gardens parking lot with careful adherence to the posted speed limit. Only when he'd traveled 3 miles down Wilson Boulevard and turned into the parking lot of a shopping center did he allow himself to pull over, turn off the engine, and sit with his head against the steering wheel while his body processed the adrenaline it had been suppressing for the past 20 minutes. He was a television repairman. He fixed broken electronics for people who couldn't afford to replace them. He was not trained for espionage, not equipped to handle discovering Soviet intelligence operations in suburban Virginia. But he also understood that what he'd found was significant, potentially critically important. That transmitter had been installed for a reason, and whatever information it was sending to Soviet receivers was information that his country's security services needed to know about. Daniel drove to a payphone outside a grocery store and called the FBI's Washington field office. The operator who answered transferred him to a duty officer who listened with patient professionalism as Daniel explained what he'd discovered. The duty officer asked him to repeat certain details, took down the address of the apartment, asked about Daniel's military background, and how he'd recognized the device. Then the officer told Daniel to go home, not to return to the apartment under any circumstances, and to expect a call later that evening from agents who would want to interview him in detail. Linda was surprised when Daniel arrived home 2 hours earlier than usual. She could tell immediately that something was wrong, knew him well enough to read the tension in his shoulders and the distraction in his eyes. But Daniel couldn't tell her what had happened, couldn't explain where he'd been or what he'd found. The FBI officer had been clear that Daniel should discuss this with no one until he'd been properly debriefed. So he mumbled something about not feeling well, about having rescheduled his afternoon appointments, and retreated to their bedroom where he lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling, replaying the events in the Novak apartment and wondering what he'd inserted himself into. The FBI agents arrived at 8 that evening. 2 men in dark suits who showed their credentials and asked to speak with Daniel privately. They sat at his kitchen table while Linda took their daughter to visit a neighbor. And for the next 3 hours, Daniel repeated his story multiple times, answered hundreds of questions, and looked at photographs that the agents produced from briefcases. Some of the photographs showed radio equipment similar to what he'd found. Others showed faces, asking if he recognized anyone, if he'd seen anyone else in the apartment or near the building. Special Agent Morris, the older of the 2 agents, explained that the FBI had been aware of unusual radio transmissions originating from the Arlington area for several months. They'd been using direction-finding equipment to narrow down the source, but the brief, infrequent nature of the transmissions made precise location difficult. Daniel's discovery had potentially identified the exact apartment where the transmissions originated, which was crucial intelligence, but also presented complications. If the Novaks realized they'd been compromised, they would immediately cease operations and possibly flee. The FBI needed to maintain surveillance, to identify everyone connected to the operation before making arrests. Special Agent Torres, younger and more intense, asked Daniel about Mrs. Novak's behavior, whether she'd seemed suspicious of him, whether anything about the apartment had seemed unusual beyond the hidden transmitter. Daniel described the encounter as accurately as he could, mentioned the woman's formal manner, the accent he couldn't place, the wallet full of cash. Torres took extensive notes and occasionally exchanged glances with Morris that suggested Daniel's observations confirmed suspicions they already held. They asked Daniel if he'd be willing to return to the apartment to complete the repair he'd described, to give them an opportunity to conduct surveillance while he was inside. Daniel felt his stomach tighten at the prospect of returning to that apartment, of sitting on the floor of a KGB safe house pretending to repair a radio while knowing that everyone in the building might be involved in espionage operations. But he also understood that refusing would mean the investigation might lose momentum, that his accidental discovery would be wasted if he wasn't willing to follow through. "I'll do it," he said, though his voice lacked confidence. "But I need to know what I'm walking into. Is this woman dangerous? Am I going to be in actual danger returning there?" Morris considered the question carefully. "We believe Helena Novak is a support operative, probably involved in communication facilitation, but not in active intelligence gathering. The transmitter you found is likely being used to relay information from multiple sources to a Soviet receiver, probably located in their embassy or at a diplomatic facility where it's protected by immunity. Mrs. Novak might not even fully understand what the device does. She might simply have been told to accept its installation and not ask questions. "But you can't guarantee my safety," Daniel said. "No," Morris admitted. "We can't. Soviet intelligence has a reputation for thoroughness. If they suspect you've discovered their operation, they could take action. But we'll have agents positioned throughout the building. We'll be monitoring the apartment. At the first sign of trouble, we'll intervene." Daniel thought about Linda and their daughter. He thought about the life he'd built, the simple existence he'd worked for, the desire to remain anonymous and uninvolved in the larger conflicts that shaped the world. But he also thought about his Navy service, about the oath he'd taken to defend his country, about the responsibility that came with being an American during the Cold War, when two nuclear superpowers faced each other across ideological divides that threatened human civilization. "Tell me what you need me to do," he said. The operation was planned with meticulous care over the following week. Daniel would call Mrs. Novak and tell her that the replacement capacitor had arrived. He would schedule another appointment, arrive at the agreed time, and spend approximately 1 hour pretending to install the new component and test the radio. FBI surveillance teams would be positioned in apartments above and below the Novak unit, having secured cooperation from those residents through a combination of patriotic appeals and vague national security explanations. Additional agents would monitor the building's entrances and exits, documenting everyone who came and went. A van equipped with radio direction-finding equipment would be parked nearby, attempting to capture any transmissions that occurred during Daniel's visit. The FBI also briefed Daniel on what to look for beyond the transmitter itself. They wanted him to note any documents visible in the apartment, to pay attention to photographs that might reveal other members of the network, to observe whether Mrs. Novak made any phone calls or received any visitors while he was present. They taught him basic counter-surveillance techniques, how to detect if he was being followed after leaving the apartment, what to do if he felt threatened during the visit. They gave him a small panic button disguised as a pager that he could activate if he encountered immediate danger. Daniel practiced his repair routine until it became automatic, ensuring he could perform the fake repair while keeping most of his attention on subtle observation. The FBI provided him with an actual replacement capacitor, properly aged and weathered, so that if Mrs. Novak or anyone else examined it later, the repair would appear genuine. They rehearsed his cover story, the technical explanation he would give for why the interference had occurred and how the new component solved the problem. On August 18th, Daniel drove his service van back to the Riverside Gardens apartment complex. He was acutely aware of the FBI surveillance teams positioned around the building, though they remained invisible to his untrained eyes. He carried his toolbox up the exterior stairs to the 3rd floor, his heart pounding hard enough that he wondered if Mrs. Novak would be able to hear it when she opened the door. She answered his knock with the same formal politeness she'd displayed the first time, though Daniel thought he detected slightly more wariness in her eyes. Or perhaps he was projecting his own paranoia onto her neutral expression. She invited him in, offered him coffee, which he declined, and directed him to the radio with a gesture that suggested she wanted the work completed as quickly as possible. Daniel knelt beside the radio and removed the back panel, hyper-aware of Mrs. Novak's position in the room. She didn't retreat to the kitchen this time. Instead, she sat on the sofa with a magazine, ostensibly reading, but Daniel could feel her attention focused on him. He worked methodically, removing the old capacitor, installing the new one, making a show of testing connections and measuring voltages. The burst transmitter remained hidden in its concealed position, undisturbed, Daniel careful not to look at it or give any indication he'd seen it before. As he worked, Daniel observed the apartment with the peripheral attention the FB had coached him to develop. The living room was sparsely decorated, with no personal photographs visible, no memorabilia or mementos that might reveal information about the occupants' lives or backgrounds. The few books on a small shelf were technical manuals and Soviet-era literature in translation, the kind of volumes that suggested people maintaining a cultural connection to their homeland. Through the partially open bedroom door, Daniel glimpsed what appeared to be a shortwave radio on a desk, more sophisticated than the console he was pretending to repair. A phone on the side table rang once during his visit, a brief burst that stopped after a single ring. Mrs. Novak glanced at it, but made no move to answer. Daniel recognized this as a probable signal, a communication technique where the pattern of rings conveyed information without requiring actual conversation. One ring might mean "all clear" or "proceed as planned," or any other prearranged message. The fact that Mrs. Novak didn't react with surprise or concern suggested this was routine, part of an operational protocol she followed regularly. Daniel finished the repair in 45 minutes, tested the radio to verify it now functioned without interference, and accepted Mrs. Novak's payment. As he packed his tools, she asked in her accented English, "This will not happen again? The interference?" "It shouldn't," Daniel replied, maintaining his professional demeanor. "The capacitor I installed should last another 10 or 15 years. If you have any more problems, don't hesitate to call." She thanked him with a coolness that suggested relief at his departure, rather than gratitude for his service. Daniel left the apartment, descended the exterior stairs with careful composure, loaded his van, and drove away from Riverside Gardens, knowing that FBI teams were photographing every moment, that his visit had provided cover for surveillance that might finally expose the full extent of the Soviet operation. He was instructed to return home and wait for contact from the FBI. 2 days passed before Special Agent Morris called to arrange a meeting. They met at a coffee shop in Ballston, sitting in a back booth where they could speak with relative privacy. Morris looked tired but satisfied, the expression of someone whose long investigation had finally achieved breakthrough. "We've identified 3 other apartments in that complex that are part of the network," Morris said quietly. The transmitter in the Novak radio was one of 4 similar devices, all transmitting to a receiver we've now located in the Soviet embassy compound. The Novaks aren't the principals. They're what we call accommodation addresses, people who allow their apartments to be used for technical operations while living apparently normal lives. The actual intelligence gathering is being done by others who pass information to these safe house operators, who then transmit it to Moscow. Morris explained that over the past 48 hours, FBI surveillance had documented meetings between Helena Novak and 2 other individuals, a man who worked as a purchasing agent for a defense contractor and a woman employed as a secretary in a Pentagon sub-office dealing with logistics. Both were now under investigation as probable Soviet sources, individuals with access to classified information who were passing that information to their handlers. "Your discovery accelerated everything," Morris said. "We were months away from identifying these people through traditional counterintelligence work. Now we have enough to start building criminal cases. But we need you to understand something, Mr. Carr. You can't discuss any of this with anyone. Not your wife, not your friends, not your customers. This investigation is ongoing. We'll be making arrests, but not immediately. We need time to document the full network, to identify everyone involved. The Novaks cannot know that their operation has been compromised." Daniel absorbed this information with a mixture of relief and frustration. Relief that he was no longer required to interact with the Soviet network, frustration that he couldn't even tell Linda why he'd been so distracted and anxious for the past 2 weeks. But he understood the necessity of secrecy, recognized that operational security required his silence. "How long?" Daniel asked. "How long before this is finished and I can know it's over?" Morris considered the question. "These investigations typically take months. We need to build court cases that will stand up to scrutiny. We need to identify everyone in the network to prevent remaining members from continuing operations after we arrest the principals. Figure 6 months minimum, possibly longer." 6 months felt like an eternity to maintain this secret, but Daniel had no choice except to agree. He returned to his routine, repairing televisions and radios for customers who had no idea their repairman had accidentally become entangled in Cold War espionage. He told Linda that the stress she'd noticed had been related to business concerns, a half-truth that allowed him to avoid detailed explanations. He tried to focus on his work, on his family, on the ordinary rhythm of his life, pushing the memory of that hidden transmitter and what it represented to the back of his mind, where it lurked as persistent background anxiety. 4 months later, on a cold morning in December, the arrests occurred. Daniel read about it in the Washington Post over his breakfast coffee, a front-page story about FBI raids on multiple locations in Arlington, the arrest of 7 Soviet intelligence operatives and 3 American citizens charged with espionage. The article mentioned Riverside Gardens apartment complex, but didn't give specific addresses. It named Helena Novak and her husband Victor, describing them as KGB support operatives who had provided technical infrastructure for an espionage network that had stolen classified information about American military logistics and defense procurement. The article explained that the investigation had been triggered by sophisticated radio direction-finding operations that had located Soviet transmitters operating illegally on frequencies reserved for military use. There was no mention of a television repairman who had accidentally discovered one of those transmitters. The FBI had kept their promise. Daniel's role in the case remained classified, his contribution anonymous. Special Agent Morris called that afternoon. "You're reading the papers, I assume?" Morris said. "I saw the article," Daniel confirmed. "It's safe now for you to know that it's over. The network is dismantled. 7 operatives are in custody, including the Novaks. 3 American citizens who were passing them information are also in custody. We recovered documentation that led to several other investigations. You should understand that what you discovered wasn't just one transmitter. It was the linchpin of an operation that had been running successfully for 4 years, stealing information that Soviet military planners were using to understand our supply chain vulnerabilities." Morris paused, then continued. "The Bureau would like to formally thank you for your assistance, though that thanks will have to remain unofficial. Your name won't appear in any public record of this case. But you should know that you made a difference, Mr. Carr. Real operational intelligence came from your willingness to trust your instincts and take action despite personal risk." After the call ended, Daniel sat in his shop's back room and thought about the strange intersection of his ordinary life with the extraordinary world of intelligence operations. He thought about the fragility of the peaceful existence that Americans assumed was natural, not recognizing how that peace depended on countless unknown individuals who noticed small details, who reported suspicious behavior, who participated in their country's defense in quiet, unacknowledged ways. He never told Linda the complete truth. The most she learned was that Daniel had provided some minor assistance to the FBI during an investigation, had given a statement about something he'd observed during a service call. She accepted this vague explanation with the understanding that some things were better left unexamined. Their daughter never knew that her father had briefly become involved in catching Soviet spies, grew up believing Daniel was simply a hard-working repairman who fixed broken electronics for honest pay. The Zenith console radio from apartment 3B at Riverside Gardens ended up in FBI evidence storage, the hidden transmitter carefully documented and analyzed by technical specialists who marveled at its sophisticated design. The radio itself was eventually destroyed after the trial, standard procedure for evidence in classified cases. But photographs of the transmitter appeared in training materials used by FBI counterintelligence officers, an example of how Soviet intelligence integrated espionage equipment into everyday household objects, relying on the assumption that American repair technicians wouldn't recognize what they were seeing. Years later, in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War began its final collapse, Daniel thought about Helena Novak and wondered what had become of her. The newspapers had reported that she and the other convicted operatives were being held for eventual prisoner exchange, the standard resolution for espionage cases where neither side wanted public trials that might expose intelligence methods. She had probably been sent back to Moscow in trade for some American agent captured by the KGB, returned to a Soviet Union that would soon cease to exist. Her life's work rendered meaningless by the geopolitical transformations that swept away the world she'd spent decades serving. But in 1981, when Daniel first discovered that transmitter hidden in the Novak radio, none of those future developments were predictable or even imaginable. The Cold War seemed eternal, the Soviet threat imminent and overwhelming. The discovery of that one small device represented a tiny victory in what felt like an endless conflict, a moment when ordinary American awareness intersected with sophisticated Soviet deception and prevented whatever damage might have resulted from 4 more years of undetected espionage. Daniel retired in 1998, selling his shop to a young electronics enthusiast who wanted to transition the business toward computer repair as televisions became disposable commodities rather than repairable appliances. On his last day, boxing up tools that had served him for nearly 3 decades, Daniel found the small camera he'd used to photograph the hidden transmitter. The film had been seized as evidence. The photographs never returned to him, but the camera remained. A physical reminder of the August afternoon when routine repair work had become something far more significant. He kept the camera in a drawer at home, occasionally taking it out to remember that peculiar chapter of his life. The story couldn't be told, the full details remaining classified even after the Cold War ended and the principals in the case were long dead or disappeared into Russian obscurity. But Daniel knew what had happened. He knew that his technical knowledge and his military training and his willingness to act despite fear had made a difference at a moment when difference mattered. And that knowledge, private and unacknowledged, was its own reward. A reminder that citizenship meant more than voting and paying taxes. It meant staying alert, trusting instincts, and accepting responsibility when ordinary life unexpectedly intersected with extraordinary circumstances. Daniel Carr had been a television repairman who fixed broken radios. But for one crucial moment in August 1981, he had also been an accidental counterintelligence asset whose observation and courage helped protect his country from enemies who operated invisibly within American society. The transmitter he discovered was never exhibited publicly. The FBI kept it in their classified collection, occasionally showing it to trainees as an example of Soviet technical ingenuity. But the real lesson wasn't about the technology. It was about the value of trained civilians who understood enough about their craft to recognize when something didn't belong, and who cared enough about their country to take action even when that action carried personal risk. Daniel Carr lived another 20 years after his retirement, dying peacefully in 2018 at the age of 76. His obituary mentioned his Navy service and his long career as an electronics repairman, but said nothing about Soviet espionage or FBI investigations. Only a handful of people knew the complete story, and most of them were now dead themselves, taking their knowledge into whatever comes after life ends. But the story existed. It existed in classified files that might someday be declassified. It existed in the memory of the few FBI agents who had worked the case and recognized Daniel's contribution. And it existed as one more example of how the Cold War was fought, not just by professional spies and government officials, but by ordinary Americans whose expertise and vigilance formed an essential line of defense against enemies who counted on apathy and ignorance to shield their operations. In the end, a broken radio in a suburban apartment had exposed a KGB safehouse and dismantled an espionage network because one television repairman knew what he was looking at and decided that reporting it mattered more than the safety of remaining uninvolved. That was Daniel Carr's Cold War service, anonymous and unacknowledged, but real nonetheless. And in a conflict where victories often came from small observations and quiet courage, that service was every bit as important as the work of trained intelligence officers with security clearances and official authority. The radio was broken. But Daniel Carr was not. And sometimes, that made all the difference. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.